The foredeck is intended to be, well, it obviously rests on these bulkhead tops and the beam up forward. At the edge of the hull, it's intended to rest on the side of the hull and then onto a piece of 3/4 inch trim that's on the outside of the hull. That is the trim at the edge of the deck that's designed to have the deck overhang it. And that's totally fine and well and good, but it leaves a problem of edge grain of plywood, which would be exposed in that particular type of installation. So what I've decided to do, which suits me in my installation, is I'm going to put a support piece on the inside, piece of 1.5 by 3/4 pine that I'll cut and fit, and epoxy into this at the top of the hull on the inside. That'll give the deck a good place to be epoxied to and screwed to. And then once it's installed, and I'll let it overhang just a touch, I'll sand and plane that edge flush with the hull, and then I'll install a piece of 1.5 inch trim that comes up and covers that 3/8 inch deck edge. So that way we still have the 1.5 inch trim on the outside, but I've designed it in a way that it'll hide the plywood deck edge. If this was all going to be paint, it wouldn't matter, because you can deal with the plywood then. But where I'm going to use a bright rail up here at the edge of the deck, I needed another plan so that it would hide the plywood, because otherwise that wouldn't look very finished in the end. So that's what I'm going to do here. My next step is just to mill up some 1.5 inch boards. These cleats are 1.5 inch wide with a 6-degree angle on one side that I milled on the table saw. A couple long ones, a few shorter ones, but I'm going to put that trim basically on the inside, and then I'll have another piece to cover the outside of the plywood. I've unclamped these. I'm not sure what to call these. It's kind of a deck clamp, shear clamp. This will be a support for the decks. This is not in the plans. This is something I added because I want to change a little bit about how the plans are done. These are epoxied in place on the forward edge of the boat on both sides. And these will just give the deck some support, a place for some fasteners out near the deck edge. And then later, there's going to be a piece of mahogany trim that will come up, cover the seam, and also cover the plywood end grain. That's why I put this piece on the inside. The plans just call for one piece along the outside, 1.5 inches, piece of trim or whatever you want to use. And then the plywood is supposed to just sit on top of it, but that would leave an exposed edge, which I didn't want because it's just unfinished looking. If it was all going to be paint, that would be fine, but I want this to be bright like the gunnel. So that's why I've changed this plan. So those are ready to go. They'll get epoxy coated when I do the rest of the interior. Pretty sneaky. The cabin deck here is shown out of an 8-foot sheet of plywood. But there's this little dotted line thing here. Turns out that the distance from the bulkhead 12, up to the beam where this deck needs to fall is about 9 feet. So I need to attach a piece of plywood to the end so that it can make up the final distance. I just measured it, and I was surprised that it's more than 8 feet. But it does show it on the plans. It just doesn't tell you what that means. These braces are here to help hold these bulkheads where they belong across the center of the boat. Obviously, the hull end is immobile and where they're supposed to be according to the plans, but with these big openings, the center part tended to flop around a little bit, so they weren't perfectly aligned. Now that I want to get the deck on, or at least get the deck patterned and templated, I've put a couple braces on here. These pieces of wood here that I've clamped between the two bulkheads are the exact same distance between the two bulkheads here at the hull, which happens to be 26 inches. So those make sure the two bulkheads are parallel with each other on both sides. And then this 2x4 across the aft end is tight against the outer edge of the bulkhead, which does not move because it's tabbed and epoxied in place. And it's brought the bulkhead flush and straight across the boat at the opening. And this is where it will need to be for the deck. Once the decks are on, obviously it'll hold it here. But at this point, what I'm looking to do is get my two deck pieces roughly cut out of the plywood so that I can do some initial work to them before I get into primer and paint. Both sides of the foredeck are going to come out of this one sheet of plywood, this 3/8 plywood. So I've got it lined up on the bulkhead, or almost, to get it to fall on the beam up there where I have a straight edge, and I'll explain that in a minute. I had to pull it aft just a touch. That's okay. I mean, if that's the level of out of spec that the whole boat is, that's okay. So I've got it basically flush here at the outboard edge. I've marked it underneath where it overhangs here. It's clamped so that it's even at the framing on the center line on both bulkheads. And I will mark the underside where it extends over the hull in a moment. Up here at the forward end, this piece of plywood actually isn't long enough to cover the whole distance. It needs roughly an extra 14 inches. It actually needs 13 something, but I've just left some extra so I can trim it. And that is kind of shown in the plans, but it's also kind of a secret because it doesn't call any real attention to it. It just sort of shows this being the deck with a little section and a dotted line, but it doesn't describe it. So this took me by surprise a little bit ago when I was looking at this. I said, I think this is longer than 8 feet. And sure enough. So I need to splice a little piece on here once I get it marked. And that extra piece can come out of the scrap from this. But first I need to get the main pieces marked. I'm using this straight edge clamped on parallel with the edge of the sheet to bring it in where it needs to be so that it rests right against this edge on my beam here. So this piece will ultimately come up and end right here at the forward end of this beam where my finger is pointing. But I'll have to splice a piece on there first. That's going to be a simple butt splice on the bottom side of this sheet of plywood. And the top side I'm just going to fill with epoxy and fair out. I don't need to seam it on both sides. So my next step is to mark roughly where to mark where it passes the hull, but I'm not going to final trim it to that size. I will leave it a little oversized when I cut it. And once I cut the first piece out, then I can repeat this process on the other side. This is where the starboard deck crosses bulkhead 9.5 right here. It's about a 1/4 inch off. And I'm not real worried about it. I'm much more concerned that the opening is parallel and 24 inches between centers. But in any case, this is where it is. We're not gonna move the hull here. There's a little wiggle room there. Pushing as hard as I can, but I'm not gonna gain a 1/4 inch. Not with the gunnels installed and these deck pieces. And that's fine. I'm really not concerned about it. I just want to fix it in the most intelligent way possible, given what we have. These are my 2 rough cut deck panels, and I've added a piece of plywood to the forward end so that they're long enough, and they're glassed in place with 2 layers of this 1708 by X tabbing, 8" and 6" or thereabouts. The 8" is not much wider than the 6. This is a leftover piece I had. Anyway, that's fine. This is plenty strong. I've got the panels and the plywood screwed to the bench to keep that seam nice and straight and tight. They're all aligned on the inside edge, which is straight. That's this edge in here. And we'll let this cure overnight, and then I can finish up the rough sizing of these panels. This is the seam. Next morning, been washed and lightly sanded. Clean up the edge a little bit. This is going to be the underside. And I brought it flush with the edge of the panel. This is the inside edge of the panel. And this is the starboard side up here. This happens to be the top side. That's what the seam looks like on the top. And this will probably get sheathed in fiberglass 6-ounce cloth for durability. At this fiberglass seam that I have, I'll mark it on both sides, and I'm going to have to take that back down to plywood so that this can sit flush, because you can see now it's got a bit of a gap right in here because it's sitting high on that plywood. I mean on that fiberglass. And I anticipated that. It's fine. I'll just mark it and grind that down. Underneath, I've traced all the bearing members in this red pen. That way, when I pull this off, I'll know where it lands on these structural members so that I don't paint those areas. And up here at the forward end, that pencil line marks the end of the deck where it crosses the structural beam here. Here on the port side, this panel goes by virtually perfectly by the opening on bulkhead 9, and it's aligned at bulkhead 12. Ultimately, these deck pieces will receive a 2x4 or a 2" wide, 1.5" wide beam that runs from the aft end forward to here. It starts out at 3.5 inches tall at the aft end and tapers down to whatever this is. It's something like 2 inches. And that will be secured to this, and that will support this long unsupported area here. That'll stiffen that up, and this will be good to go. And here are my marks. The red line on the port side where it crosses all these structural members. And we'll see this when I take the panel off. The forward end, I have a pencil mark because I want that one to be a little more precise. And there's my final mark in the red, exactly tracing the hull. The black line I did by holding the pen straight against the hull like this. That was intentionally further out than it needed to be. But now I want to trim this basically to its exact shape. Here's where the decks ended up. They're now cut to final size. They're all marked on the bottom to show where they cross structural members. And I've trimmed this fiberglass tabbing back to the line. So that's now down flush. Sanded just a little bit of the top veneer, so you can see. That's all right. That'll just get made up with epoxy when I install these for permanently. So we'll do one more test fit, see how the deck edge looks, and that'll be it until these are ready to be epoxy coated and then primed and painted. So here are the two deck pieces mocked up and basically cut to fit. I've got them temporarily screwed to the edge, just 3 screws to hold it. I'm going to go over this and just sand this flush with the hull on both sides. We're flush at the bulkhead. And this starts to give an idea of this birdwatcher slot. This is basically the final appearance here, minus the framing that goes around the top edge of this. Basically 1.5 inches wide and between 2 and 3 inches tall. It tapers from aft to forward, taller at the aft end. This shows the walk-through slot. That's kind of the hallmark of this boat. And I like it. We'll go around and look at the starboard side. So once I get these shapes to the final contours on the edge of the hull, which just needs a little bit of shaping, I cut it pretty much at the line, but just needs a little cleaning up. And eventually there will be a piece of trim that comes up and covers this edge. This way I can install this deck and then install this trim. It'll cover that edge and cover the seam. That's why I put the support on the inside first, to which this is now screwed in 3 places. So I'm going to put some tape on the hull for protection so I don't sand the hull. And I'll just carefully sand this. It doesn't need a lot, but just a little cleanup. So here are the decks. They've now been finally sized to fit. Just went around and lightly sanded this edge to bring it right up flush with the hull everywhere. There's a view from aft. This little section here will get a piece of plywood as a flat deck, runs from side to side, and I'll cut and fit that in the near future. Take a walk down the port side. Again, this is all flush now with the hull, and eventually this will get a piece of trim to cover that edge. And here's a view from the cockpit looking forward through this slot. And this is basically how it will be when all is said and done, minus the beams that are on each side, which will help support the plywood up here where it's kind of sagging in this long span. One of the main selling features of the boat to me was this ability to walk all the way forward and be ensconced. Pretty cool, I think. So here we go. Decks are mocked up. They won't be installed for a little while, but these initial steps will help me get the decks painted and so forth before installation as well. The underside, the exterior will get painted after installation. But I'd like to get all the inside stuff done. It's all going to be sprayed. It will be a whole heck of a lot easier if I do it before this deck goes on. This is an offcut of 5/8 plywood from the bottom somewhere, and I'm going to use it to template or to make basically the last piece of the deck. It's this little foredeck. Goes forward to the beam. It's going to extend up to the bulkhead that's right in this area, and I'll just mark it and trim it according to the shape of the hull. But this piece is big enough on both sides, so I'll just mark it all around. I'm going to mark the beam where it crosses underneath so that I can put a cleat in there. Inside the boat here, I've marked this beam, the forward edge of this beam, with the bottom of this plywood so that I can install a cleat across. And I also marked the insides of the structural members just because. And there is the foredeck, cut and in place, dry. I used a straight edge to cut both sides. One side had a little bit of a shape, so I went to the outboard most part of the line. So I've got some room to shape this if I want. It's not much, yeah, it's this one. Just a little bit of room to trim here because of the slight shape of this part of the hull. But it needs a cleat on that side against the beam. And up here, the bulkhead is just a little low, but that'll take up with epoxy adhesive when it's time to install this. So that was an easy piece. It was 3 quick cuts. And that piece is designed to be flat and straight like it is.